Okay, guys, now we're going to cover the biology section of the TEAS test. So biology is the study of life. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk about what it is that all living things are composed of, how each living thing functions, and how they're classified. Okay, so each living thing is composed of 4 major macromolecules. The first one is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, or carbs, are just simple sugars. So for each macromolecule, you will find that there's a monomer, which is a single unit of that macromolecule, and a polymer, which is just a chain of monomers. So for carbohydrates, the monomer is called a monosaccharide. So a monosaccharide is just a single sugar. That could be glucose, galactose, or other sugars. A polymer is just a chain of sugars. So for instance, you could have a chain of sugars forming cellulose, which is the major component of plant cell walls, or starch, which is the major component in potatoes. So carbohydrates in the human body specifically are normally used for short-term energy. So when you need a quick burst of energy, like going for a sprint, you will use your carbohydrates or lifting weights. Lipids are the long-term energy in the human body. So their monomer is just a single fatty acid chain. So it's a hydrocarbon chain, which means it's composed of just carbons and hydrogens, and they can either be saturated or unsaturated. Saturated or unsaturated is determined if it can hold extra hydrogen in its bonds. Okay? So the monomer is a fatty acid. A polymer in the human body is a triglyceride. So a triglyceride is 3 fatty acids bonded to a glycerol molecule. In the human body, that's used whenever your short-term energy supply runs out and you have to convert your long-term energy into short-term energy. Proteins are composed of amino acids, and amino acids combine to form polypeptide chains. So polypeptide chains can form specific structures based on how they're composed and folded, and each specific structure allows for a specific function. So for any cellular function, you will have a very specific protein for it. In the human body, amino acids that we make naturally. However, there are 9 amino acids that we can only obtain through diet. Nucleic acids are just the nitrogenous bases that are found in DNA and RNA. So the monomer for nucleic acids is called a nucleotide, which would be adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, or uracil. Now, a polymer would be a polynucleotide, and those form chains, which we call DNA or RNA. And their major purpose in the human body is just for genetic information. Okay, speaking of, in the TEAS test, you'll have to know the difference between DNA and RNA. So DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is used predominantly for genetic information. So the genes that code for you being specifically you and the specific functions in your body are stored in your DNA. You can tell that's DNA because it has a double helix structure or a winding staircase, and it contains a specific nucleotide called thymine. So again, DNA is a double helix containing thymine, and you only find it in the nucleus. However, in order to create proteins, DNA is transcribed into RNA. So RNA is ribonucleic acid, and it's the code that converts DNA into proteins, which has very specific functions. So again, RNA is a single string, and it contains a specific nucleotide called uracil. And you only find it in the cytoplasm. So again, DNA is transcribed into RNA, and then that RNA is taken to the ribosome where it's converted into a protein. So now we're going to go over what an animal cell is. So a cell is the smallest unit of life for any organic creature. Now in a cell, there are organelles, and each organelle has a very specific function in the cell. So for example, lysosomes are responsible for cleanup, and mitochondrions are responsible for creating energy. So in our LibGuides, we have a handout of all the various organelles you will find within a cell and their various functions, and you definitely want to know them. So mitosis is just how one cell becomes 2. So mitosis only occurs within your somatic cells. So somatic cells are basically your non-sex cells, any other cell that's not found in the ovaries or testes. So what happens is it takes one cell splits it into two, and those two cells are genetically identical to the original cell. And we call them diploid because they take the amount of chromosomes you have and split it into two. For humans, for instance, if you have a cell, inside you'll have 46 chromosomes. And at the end, when it splits, each cell will have 23, but those 23 are genetically identical. Meiosis, however, occurs within your sex cells, or gametes. Now, meiosis is essentially mitosis happening twice, but on the first round of mitosis, here, you will have what's called genetic crossover, which is essentially a blending of your mom and dad's genes to form a unique you. And then it will undergo a split again and will form 4 haploid cells. So it takes the amount of chromosomes you have and splits them into 4. So again, mitosis occurs within your somatic cells, produces 2 identical cells. Meiosis happens in sex cells, produces 4 genetically different cells. Okay, so Punnett squares try to predict the outcome of meiosis genetic crossover. So they try to predict the genotype. So the genotype is the actual genetic makeup that the offspring will have, resulting in a specific phenotype. So a phenotype is the actual physical expression of a specific genotype. So for instance, you could have a genotype of, let's say, big T, and the phenotype for that is blonde hair. So the difference between big T and little t is a big T is what we call a dominant gene, while a little t is called recessive. So a dominant gene means that if you are a carrier for that gene, you will display that phenotype for that gene. A recessive means that if you have that recessive, you have to get the recessive gene from both your mom and dad to have a possibility of expressing that phenotype. Okay? So the possible outcomes we have are homozygous dominant. So that's where you get 2 dominant genes from your mom and dad, which means that you will display the dominant gene and you'll be a carrier for the dominant gene. You will have heterozygous, which are these options here. So heterozygous means that you will display the dominant gene, but you'll be a carrier for both the dominant and recessive gene. So for instance, let's say that brown hair is dominant over blonde hair. That would mean that if I got this, I would display brown hair, but my children have a possibility of having blonde hair. Okay? And finally, you have homozygous recessive. So homozygous recessive is the only way in which a recessive gene will be expressed. So for instance, again, if brown hair is dominant, blonde hair is recessive, this means that I will display blonde hair and I will pass on blonde hair to my offspring. Okay? So now we're going to cover how a cell creates energy, or how all living organisms produce the energy they need to survive. So what this is called respiration. And again, this occurs within your mitochondrion. So respiration is essentially taking a simple sugar, in this case glucose, and you're going to burn it in the presence of oxygen. Not literally burn, but it's a good analogy. You're going to burn it in the presence of oxygen, and that's going to produce CO2, water, and ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which is the major energy molecule within the human body. So if anything requires energy in the human body, adenosine triphosphate is usually what you use. Big thing to note is that a byproduct of respiration is CO2. So that's why when you exhale, what you're doing is you're removing all that byproduct. And when you inhale, you're trying to take in more oxygen so you can do more respiration. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how animals and living organisms are classified, which is done by taxonomy. So taxonomy is just an organization system by which we specifically divide up the different various organisms that exist on the planet. Okay, so each animal is specifically called by its genus and species. So for instance, humans are the genus Homo and the species Sapiens. So we are Homo sapiens. Okay. So you're going to definitely want to know just which category encompasses the other categories, or you want to think of which one's bigger than the other, if that makes sense. So domain encompasses everything, domain, kingdom, and then phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So a way to remember that is this mnemonic device: do, keep, ponds clean, or fish get sick. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.